Thank you, Dan, for this interview. Il vostro istituto è in grado di stabilire quale nazione produce più armi, quale nazione compra di più, o la cosiddetta triangolazione rende difficile questo calcolo?
Look, there are a lot of uncertainties in the data. So the more detail you seek, the more you find there is imprecision. But if you keep the question relatively general, then it is possible to answer it with a great deal of confidence. There is absolutely no doubt that the USA is the world's largest producer and purchaser and seller of weapons. It dominates the statistical picture on military spending and on the arms trade, where I think that today it is responsible for over 40% of global arms exports. So then there's this system, this practice of selling from one country to another and then on to a third party to sort of evade international observation of arms transfers, of arms sales. And actually, that doesn't work very well. In the end, most arms transfers, the vast, vast majority of transfers of major weapons are visible to international observers like ourselves. But with, as I said, when you get into the real fine detail with some imprecision, but the big picture is very clear.
In Italia si discute tanto del cosiddetto piano rearm. C'è chi dice che è solo un incentivo per le singole industrie belliche, quelle nazionali, e c'è chi invece dice no, è il primo passo per la difesa europea. Chi ha ragione?
The first thing to say is that the program is badly named, because we talk about rearmament as if Europe at the moment were unarmed. And that simply is not true. European Union member states plus the UK have very high military spending, much more than Russia does, and have between them quite capable armed forces, but the armed forces and the arms industries are quite divided from each other. So one of the questions which has lurked in thinking about European defense for at least 50 years, to my knowledge, is the question of whether the European arms industries and the European armed forces should come closer together. Should they have more, not just more joint activities, but actually joint formation? If you think about it, 28 states working together, each with their own armed forces, have very high transaction costs. You have that many general headquarters, you have that many general armed forces for the generals to run, you have that many ministries of defense, you have that many different pension systems, and so on. You have no economies of scale. So large countries with much larger populations like the USA, Russia, or China can do much, much more because they get economies of scale. So one of the questions for Europe is, should European forces come closer together? Now, I think that this so-called rearmament plan gives no answer in either direction. It would be perfectly possible for it to be implemented, and to be implemented in such a way that it encouraged unification of arms industries, of companies, of corporations, alignment of procurement policies between the states so that they're buying the same kinds of weapons all the time, and possibly even much closer coordination of the different armed forces of the different governments, even leading to a point where they're almost sharing their armed forces together and reducing their transaction costs. That's possible. But I think it's also possible that it goes in the other way, that it strengthens the individual arms industries of those countries that have particular military industrial capacity, and that the armed forces remain separate. I think in the end that as long as the armed forces remain separated from each other, you will always see a degree of separation in the arms industries as well, because they are meeting a market. So yes, I think the question is a big question, which has been going for at least half a century, has not been resolved, and will not necessarily be resolved now. But I think what you can also see is that because of Trump, the leadership of European governments, of most of them, has become very, very concerned that they can no longer rely on the USA for their security. And that must encourage greater European unification in the military effort. The next question to ask is whether that is really a good thing or a bad thing. But I think that one further point could be made, which is that just saying that the solution to the problems that we face, given Russia's aggression against Ukraine, is to spend more money, is not necessarily a solution. Generally speaking, if you throw a lot of money at a problem, you don't find a solution. You find inefficiency, waste, and corruption. So I should put a lot more focus onto not just how much money do we spend, but how do we spend it.
Thank you, Dan. È vero o è falso che le industrie d'armi danno tanto lavoro e sviluppano tecnologie che poi vengono utilizzate anche per scopi civili?
I think the evidence over the long period of time is mixed. So you could say, for example, that the Second World War is what saved the US economy after the crash of 1929 and the depression of the 1930s. But during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it was very clear that the countries that had the fastest economic growth rates were the ones which had the less military spending. And this was thought to be because investment in the civilian sector was much more profitable. It was safe to invest in the military sector, but it wasn't as profitable in terms of the amounts that came out. So the civilian sector was more dynamic. And the problem was that if you invested in the military sector, that displaced investment in the civilian economy, and that led to lower economic growth overall. I think that in recent years, it's been more mixed because especially for Europe, the long-term economic growth rate has been declining. So that each time we have an economic crisis, we recover kind of a little bit more slowly at a slightly lower level. But I would be very surprised if you got clear evidence now to show that military spending was actually over a considerable period, such as a decade, really generating more growth and more jobs. I think that in the short term, you might see that, especially if economies have been at a low ebb. If you pump some money in, whatever you pump it into, you'll get jobs and you'll get growth as those newly employed workers with nice salaries start to spend on consumer goods and so on. But over a period of time, I think that effect would go. And I certainly don't think that it should be ever used as a justification to say that, well, we need to spend more on the military in order to boost the economy. No, the reason for spending more on the military, if it's there, is because you wish to have more security and you believe you can achieve it with these more weapons, more forces, newer weapons, etc. Not because you want jobs or growth, because you can get that by spending on a whole lot of other things. Spend it on building hospitals and schools, and you will still get that boost to jobs and economic performance overall.
And this the last question. Sulla base dei vostri studi, dove prenderanno i soldi anche i paesi europei per comprare più armi? Per esempio del welfare?
In principle, there are three ways in which you can fund increased military spending. You can do it because your economy grows, and so all of the quantities of which you're taking 3% or 2% or whatever it is, they're all increasing, so military spending grows, but also because the economy is doing so well, health and education spending increase as well. Okay? The second way is that you can increase taxes. So you leave all of the welfare spending where it is, and you increase taxes, perhaps especially on the very rich, and out of this you get enough money to be funding the increased spending on the military. And if the economy is not growing well enough, and for political reasons you can't increase taxes or find another way to increase government revenue, then the third way is obviously that you have to spend less on something. The first choice for actually reducing spending at the moment is overseas development assistance. So it is less spending on welfare, not at home, but overseas. But that's a relatively small part of the national income. I mean, so for example, in Britain, you can see it had been spending 0.7%. Because of the pandemic, they cut to 0.5, and now because of wanting to spend more on defense, they cut to 0.3. But that's only 0.2 of British gross national income. And the target is to be spending 0.5 more in just a few years. So that extra money, if they won't tax, then it must come from other kinds of spending. Infrastructure, welfare, policing, communications, whatever it may be. There is evidence that some countries at different times either reduce or restrain their welfare spending in order to fund increases in military spending. Sometimes what it's about is not that they are actually cutting the welfare spending, but they're not letting it increase at the same speed. It's a kind of austerity program in social protection and welfare programs while the military are able to thrive.